So that's it. Uh, as wait a second. Okay, as Andrea said, I am Alessandro Pisa, and basically he already said that I have a background in physics. Then something went wrong, and I started working with Plone. And yes, I started since 2014 working on Quave, and basically since 2016 when I joined CISLab, I've been doing a lot of work on Plone Internet, but also on regular Plone sites. And I did a lot of stuff regarding PASS. What is PASS? PASS is the pluggable authentication service, and it basically it is a product that it is documented there. You can find the links. You can find the repository on GitHub. This is not really an introduction to PASS. Matt Hamilton in Brasilia gave an excellent talk on how to get yourself introduced to the pluggable authentication service. And I invite you to watch it or to check his slides. The video is on YouTube on the PloneConf channel. And basically, all is said is still valid because, as you know, PASS is pretty stable and pretty old. When I was writing these words a couple of days ago, a bug was fixed on PASS, but that's another story. But that's it. So what does PASS do? PASS is doing basically all the stuff that is related to the user and groups in Zope and Plone. For example, it manages the authentication, the permissions of the user and group properties, and it also has some function to do search user and groups. How PASS works? PASS basically can fetch or set information from your site about, of course, about users and groups. It can do that, fetching or setting information from the request, and also from external services. So you can use PASS to connect, for example, to an Active Directory, Kerberos, a relational database, stuff like that. You can even do fancy stuff, for example, two-factor authentication, single sign-on. You can lock out users that are trying to access your system and fail to authenticate many times. PASS, to do that, uses plugins. That's why pluggable. And it is heavily based on the Zope component architecture. This is PASS inside the ZMI because PASS is a tool, which means that it is a persistent object which has methods that we can call. And it is a container. To see that, you can go to the ZMI of your Zope website, of your Zope application, and check the ACL users folder. That is the materialization in the ZODB of your tool. And inside, you can find that it has plugins, and you can check which of these plugins, which are also persistent objects, are active. You can see that you have 3 columns here. In the first column, you have the plugin type, and you have many plugin types. We will briefly check them later. And that you have another column with active plugins and another column with available plugins, which are not active, but can be activated. And also plugins can be ordered, so that, for example, if you want to authenticate your users, you have plugin that for extracting information from the request that comes from the users, you might have many extraction plugins that try to understand, for example, the user and password, the username and the password that the user submits to your website, and there might be many plugins of that kind, and they might extract different information. And there are another type of plugins that will try to verify that the username and the password that you provide are the valid one. For example, you can have the user plugin that checks that the password stored in the plugin is the same that you provided. Of course, after encrypting it and verifying the encrypted one. You can even see that many plugin types have no plugin at all. That is because not everything needs implementation. You can start from a basic thing and then add more plugins later. So we have different plugin types. I will not go into the details, but the important things that you can take away is that all those plugins interact with each other. So you can have multiple, as I said, multiple plugins for extraction that interact with multiple plugins for authentication. Okay. So another thing is that we have in Plone a product which is called Products Plone Pass that adds things to this already pluggable thing, as we don't have enough stuff on on the pass itself. So, for example, it patches pass to add new group introspection plugins and other kind of types of plugins. Especially, I would like to point out the local role plugins. Local roles plugins, local roles are already a thing in regular ZOP, but they are not pluggable, and Plone makes them pluggable. This is, it is not important that you can read what is written here, but it is just to show you that if you go inside your Plone site, you will find another ACL users folder with its own plugin. On the right, you have the Plone one. On the left, the one that we saw before at the root of the ZOP application. And as you can see, you have different types of plugins, as we saw. And also the beautiful thing is that in the Plone one, they are ordered alphabetically. And we have many more. For example, as you can see, we have 2 plugins for the Borg local roles. Probably it is most, but it is small, but you can still read it. That you have local roles and plugins, and for example, you have Borg local roles, and on the other side the local roles. And for example, you have plugins that are not provided by ZOP, but are provided by Plone. For example, the validation plugin that checks that the password that you insert is at least 5 characters, but of course you can add your own plugin to verify that the password is whatever you want. This is, for example, the comparison of the users plugin in ZOP and the one in Plone. They are basically almost identical, but they manage 2 different user sources. And so the users in ZOP might have different properties with users that are in Plone. So let's make a quick recap with the important point that will be useful later. This is pretty important because what we will see later will be quite complex, and so we need to make some recaps to sum up some things that are important. So basically, PASS manages security users and groups, 2 plugins, and plugins can be activated, deactivated, and even ordered. And plugins do interact with each other, and what PASS does, it orchestrates them. Usually, it does that using the order that you provide. So we said that we have a pluggable infrastructure. Let's go to the kitchen, pick some plugin, and try to build something. This story. The title of the talk is Past Adventures. So this is something that really happened, and what I'm talking about is one of the first Plone internet setup that we had. So we wanted our Plone internet to be to use an Active Directory. To do that, we went to PyPy and took our first ingredient, which was Products Plone LDAP. I know that now there is plus plugins LDAP, which is more fancy and Python 3 and 5.2 ready, but at the time this was the safest choice probably, so it was picked. It is basically a Plone product that pulls in some other products by already done by Jens Fagelpool, and products Plone LDAP user folder and LDAP multi-plugins. For the first, we have the GitHub repository, and the second one is just available as a PyPy package. And I did not find any GitHub repository for that. Those one, of course, are useful to authenticate and to get the user properties for an Active Directory. And of course, it works also for OpenLDAP, basically anything that implements the LDAP protocol. It is also nice that this product ships with a basic LDAP client functionality in the ZMI. So even if you don't have an LDAP client ready, or you're not really keen to work with the CLI of LDAP, you can extract information from LDAP pretty quickly. Then the other thing that we wanted is products Membrane. Membrane is a cool product. I bet everybody knows about it. And the cool thing is that with it, we can manage users and groups with the really beautiful dexterity machinery that we have on Plone. And so it is really good to have that, because the editor experience can be really pretty and consistent with the other content types they are managing. So we can use Plone content types as a source. So instead of storing stuff in the plugins itself, we can store it in the Plone content. And so we can have a content type for a user where we can store the, for example, the email, the address, the location, the title, if it's male, female, birth date, whatever you can think about. And we can even have a content type as a group, and we can maybe have folderish groups so that we can put users inside the group or not, depends what is your implementation. And basically Membrane provides you a generic infrastructure that you then have to implement it yourself with your own content types. So another feature really interesting is the Membrane catalog, which is something good and something bad that this product have. It is good because it provides you a fast way to index your content types, and so with the Membrane catalog you can fetch easily information about your groups and users, but also it can be a little tricky because maybe it is called too much, but we will see that later. Another product we were checking is Collective Workspace. Collective Workspace is a really smart product because it can manage the permission using, basically it manages the role assignment using groups instead of the standard sharing functionality that Plone has. And it does that, delegating, this causes a very fast permission delegation because it automatically creates some special groups. Those special groups have an ID like admins, column, the UID of the object, guests, column, the UID of the object, and basically whatever you like, because you can implement your own groups. And instead of using the sharing tab, that whenever you add a user to the sharing tab, all the content inside the folder is reindexed. It just adds the user to one of those groups, and automatically the permissions are already set. No reindexing is needed, so the permission delegation is really instant. We also had some our own plugins in Plone Internet. Mainly, they were implementation of the Membrane content types that we were using. Also, we had a plugin to allow workspaces from collective workspace added as a member of other workspaces. So we can add a sort of group inheritance. We had the customization for collective workspace to add custom groups and some plugin for assigning local roles. So the recipe, basically, the recap is this one. This is, we had a plugin to manage groups from LDAP, users group through membrane, custom permission implementation, and improve permission management with collective workspace. Plus, we need the icing on the cake, which is cache. Cache is really important because permissions are checked quite often in Plone, and if to do that you need to query external services, like for example LDAP, this is something which is mandatory. And so this is the result. This is an amazing homemade zuppa inglese, which really tastes great, and we were pretty proud of the outcome. But then one day, as usual, when you go live on your system, the site, after some time, slows down. Why the site slows down? Because the user base was growing. The number of workspaces that the user were using was growing. And that was causing, for example, repetitive many calls to LDAP, which is a really great service. It is really fast, but it turned out that we were asking too many things to him in the wrong way, and so we had a kind of slowdown because of our too many queries to LDAP, even with the cache in place. So it was really a problem. Then we also noticed that we were using the membrane catalog too much. And also, we noted that using the membrane catalog was causing the catalog queue to flash. So you know that since we have in 5.1 we have this catalog queue, and before we added a product for that. But basically, that catalog queue can be used to delay all the writes to the catalog until the transaction is committed or a query to the catalog is made. Of course, using the membrane. The membrane catalog was making query to the catalog and causing the catalog to process its queue. And this, of course, was not nice because we were losing our advantage of delaying all the writes to the catalog until the end. And this was also a problem because other than the catalog, we were also writing on Solar, which is an external service, and so another external call which takes times and is blocking ourselves. So the customer was like little bit like this, and he wanted his cake back, and so we needed to find some solution. Basically, before finding any solution, you need to understand what's happening, because otherwise you will never get reach to any point. And basically, this made us think about all the infrastructure that there was there, because each of those products alone were working pretty nice, written by really clever people, and they were doing their job in a marvelous way. The problem was that when PAS was not finding what he was looking for, he was trying to use all the plugins, for example, for taking user and group properties, to check the permission and the group membership and the roles. And PAS was abused. Why? Because, for example, there were many groups, for example, the collective workspace groups, which had sense just inside the workspace, that basically were for sure collective workspace groups, but PAS did not know about that, because PAS thought, okay, I have this group ID, I should ask LDAP about information about him. I should ask Membrane about information about him, and I should ask all the other group plugins about information about him. And that is, of course, wrong, because you will ask LDAP for information that it does not have. You will ask Membrane for an information that it does not have, and whoever knows. So basically, throwing all those plugins together and letting Pass do his job was not performant enough when you have a lot of groups and users to manage. So this was basically identified as the main reason of the bottleneck. Just to let you understand what was the situation of the users and group in that site, I will show you a family picture, a wonderful family picture. This is so. In order to understand that, I know this is kind of scaring. You need to understand that on the border of these ellipses, you have points, and each of these points is a group or a user. Okay, I don't want you to understand immediately what is happening now, but what you have to see is that you have lines converging to a few points. Okay. Imagine what those few points. Those few points are a few users that are really important one in the site, and they were managing most of the content, and not just that, they were the people that were actually paying for the site. So the connections between the points in the ellipses and the point where the line focus is a group membership. So you see that there were few users where all the lines focus, and basically the lines start from a few groups where they add admin permissions. So the line starts in the admins column UID group from collective workspace. So basically, those users started creating lots and lots and lots and lots of workspaces, and they were assigning them as manager, as members, and so single users started to have something like thousands of groups, because every workspace creates many groups, as you saw. So it was a kind of abuse of the system. So to start fixing things, we started to remove LDAP from the game. So we decided that given that it is a remote source and it is not changing that often, we could synchronize the content from LDAP to our website. Of course, this has some drawbacks, because LDAP is really great, but as we mentioned, we were using in the wrong way, and to get fresh information. But if we could store the LDAP information in Plone, then basically we could have we could write better plugins and faster plugin to get what we wanted. And basically membrane ones. So we were removing one plugin from the game. Of course, this has the drawback, because you have a cron job. You have to be sure that the cron jobs run and know when somebody writes on LDAP, then you will not have the information immediately available. So some drawbacks. And then we also patched Pass, because if it was not enough that Plone was patching the pluggable authentication service, we also patched it, and in a way that when Pass was receiving a group, instead of getting all those information from all the plugins, it should be smart enough to try to understand from the ID if that one was a collective workspace group, a user, or a regular group, and so decide by itself if it made sense to use all the active plugins or just a bunch, because we said that you can activate and order the plugins. So basically, you can actually orchestrate the way plugins are used. And there are some plugins where the first one that matches it is used and the other one not. But in this case, it was really better to make pass smart enough to understand which one of the active pick immediately. And that was also another good improvement in terms of performance. Okay, so basically I already said that. And there was another problem with the role manager. You know why browsing with admin is really fast? Because basically whenever you check a permission and you are admin, you have that permission. But if you don't have it, first you will look for the roles that have that permission, and then you will check the permission of your groups. That's why we have collective workspaces and its mechanism. The problem was that there were a few users, as you saw, 4 or 5, that were in lots of workspaces. And so they belong to a lot of users. And the local role manager is checking if any of those thousands of groups were available for add that role and then the permission. And so it was really, really slow to iterate over all those groups. So we decided to replace the Plone local role manager with a custom one that was actually, again, checking in a smart way which group should be used. Because if the problem was that we had too many collective workspace group which were actually effective inside a single workspace, well, basically, if you are in that workspace, you should check for just a bunch of groups, even if you have thousands of them. And then if you are outside the workspace, you should even discard all those collective workspace group. And then we could skip those groups because they were unrelated to the context. Then there is another plugin, which is a group plugin in Pass, which is the recursive groups. And if you have recursive groups, things can be really, really tough, because you're depending on how your site is structured. Having the recursive groups can be really expensive, because you need to check for each one, again, of those 2,000 groups if they have parent groups. And given that we could have collective workspaces groups inside the collective workspaces, that could take pretty some time. So in order to do that, to fix that, we needed to find a way to really resolve this problem in a Blaze. And so in order to get that in the proper way, we decided to use graphs. Graphs are mathematical entity with, in short, they deal with related objects. The relationship now, it's the group membership. But of course, for example, also workflows can be modeled with graphs. And so our node in the graph are users and groups. And the so-called edges of the graph is the group membership. To do that, we used a library called NetworkX, which is pretty amazing. So you see on the right a kind of a graph. 1, 2, 3, 4 are the nodes, and the arrows are expressing the relationship. This in particular is a directed graph, so that you can identify very well who is the parent and who is the children, and who are the children. So this is an example code of a graph modeling an organization. You see that we import an access from NetworkX. We created the graph, and we can add edges that describe our relationship. And it's pretty cool. Actually, the figure is made from that graph. It can export in the dot format, and you can see that the graph is right there. So it's really pretty simple to model a somewhat complex organization. Also, it is pretty straightforward to understand who is your parent in the language of the network X library, the predecessors, or who are your children, the successors. And it is also pretty files. So given that we have this kind of thing available, we could replace all the group plugins, basically, and especially the recursive group plugins, with this kind of stuff in order to have, once the user of the group was known, all his parents in a blaze. How was the graph in the real life? Well, actually, displaying something like that with all the labels was not possible, because we had something like 20,000 nodes, which is user and groups, 25 relations, and creating the graph was pretty fast, but with these kind of numbers, Network X can work even with millions of nodes and edges is not a problem. And of course we can cache that, and browsing from one point to the other of the graph is immediate. And that's again the family picture. I actually made use of that Network X library to plot this one. Of course, I could not plot it like the previous beautiful organization tree, because the structure is more complex and you would see anything if I start to add label. I actually had some kind of issues to show this picture, because all the lines have an opacity of 1%. It means that they are 99% transparent, or that if you want to see a black dot in the figure, you have to have at least 100 lines superimposed. Yes, basically this is all the nodes displayed on that ellipsis, and you can see that basically almost all the edges are relative to very few people. That's it. So how about the nodes? So we now have these structures. We have to model the nodes and the edges in a way that we can get use it. So we decided to use strings for as the nodes, and the strings have principal types called the UID. So possible principal types are, of course, user profile. That means that it is a user. Work group, that means it's a regular group, a membrane group. Collective, and then we have a principal type which mimics every collective work group category, let's say. And if what was that? I don't know why I wrote that, but so. But that's it. So an edge. So the parent child relationship can be written something like that, so that we know that the user profile with a certain UID is a member of that collective workspace members. So the actual data structure where we stored the nodes was this one, which is actually a B-tree, which is a mapping between the UID, which is not the UID but the pass, the node UID, so the principal types column, the object UID, and it was pointing to the path of the object. So if we wanted, we could resolve the original object pretty fast and get all the information we wanted by traversing to the object. We also had another mapping that was taking the path, and it was transforming it into the name. Also, this one was a B-tree. And then we had a third mapping that was finally mapping the name back to the UID. So we had this kind of circular reference between those three objects. And in order to keep the edges, we got an O3 set. Those are fancy structures which are basically which are persistent and conflict have a native conflict resolution. They are pretty fast, and they consume very few space in your ZB. Okay, so already said that. And also, we could use the name to translate the information which is really understandable by the machine to a name of the group of the user, and we could use even that for making a basic search. And given that data structure was in place, we could create a graph adding all the nodes from that mapping that will take all the keys of that mapping, and then adding the edges. And to keep the graph updated, of course, we needed some sort of events. Luckily, all the plugins and PaaS were providing the event, were notifying all the events that we needed. And okay, so basically, with this recursive plugin, group plugin, we could have all the information about our organization that we wanted, really in a fast way. So even if you are a member of 2,000 objects, I can understand that immediately. And then usually when I want to iterate on those, we will always use batching. And so even if, I don't know, for example, if under a group you have 2,000 users, when we wanted to display those thousands users, we could use batching. And for checking the role, we already said that we were skipping most of the groups that were not using. So we never need to resolve the properties and and other sensible information for groups or users all together. So we even decided to speed things up, removing, trying to remove for one user as an experiment its membership through collective workspace and replacing it with local roles. So you see that, for example, this one was the user that had the most connection to the workspaces because he wanted to know really well what was happening there. So we replaced this group membership with regular local roles. It took time because we needed to reindex all the documents because, as I mentioned before, sharing a local role takes more time than assigning that user to the group. But basically, then you see that we lost all that connection, and so the browsing speed for him was really better. So just use a local role when it's needed, and probably it will be an admin forever, and you will never remove it, and you will never need to reindex his permission anyway. So use the proper permission in the fine way in the when it's needed. Already said. So, and now we have the cake back. The site is pretty slick and it continue growing, and we are happy with that. So, small recap. If you can remove a connection to external system, know the limitation on your plugins and be careful when you mix them. You can even patch pass to make it smarter when it's needed, so that you can have even plugin on demand, not just active and activated or ordered in some way. A custom worker role that tries to understand what's used, which groups are good and which are bad, and and also we have this wonderful graph-based group plugin that saves tons of time in our website. Also rationalize the plugin usage because sometimes you need very few plugins, and maybe you want to write your own depending on your website. What's next? Of course, we can improve it if we have time. I can tell that, otherwise I can skip. So we can, for example, now when you create a workspace, it will automatically create all the groups for you. So all the admins group, the members group, and stuff like that. But we can do that lazily, so that when you actually need the admins group or the editors group or whatever group you need, you will create that on demand. We can even think about getting some properties for the group and the user lazily, so not that all the information from your group and user is needed. Maybe you need just the name, or maybe you need just the email, and you don't need to know everything about him from all the plugins in the world. And also, for example, we can even lazily load group and user, maybe prioritizing some group provider on the local provider that we think are better to use in the moment. So some takeaways, but maybe this is almost redundant. I can quit it if you want. So pass is great. Everything we saw was great, but sometimes you have just to limit it because it's too much. So maybe if instead of using tons of plugins, just write your own that do the what you need efficiently, and well, that depends of the knowledge of your stack, and that's it. So thank you. I would like to thank you, Syslab, that was sponsoring my stay here, and all you wonderful Plone community, and of course Bio, and all the guys from Red Turtle and Biodec that was really kind to organize this conference. Thank you very much.
Thank you. Question?
You mentioned that you patched paths to give it some more knowledge about your stack. I was wondering if there was a reason you did that rather than try to write a plugin that would delegate to other ones, because I don't know the best approach. I've tried both and I hated both.
Yeah, there is no, of course, it depends really about what you have under your hands in that moment. The patch that we did is not something that is suitable for any other website that has different use cases. So, but you know, when you order plugins, you usually order the plugins. You put first the plugins that you think they will match first. But in our case, it was not really possible because at the time we had LDAP and Membrane. So we had half of the user base on LDAP, half of the groups on Membrane. So that was not possible. So it's really a tricky solution that proved to be working, but of course it's not actually the super best. Maybe some other group of plugin types that does that for you might be a good idea, but that might be even too much, I think. So
Another one? Okay. Thank you, Alessandro.
thank you to you.
Thanks for coming.